I absolutely think that this approach can be scaled up to the urban scale, that we may look at whole buildings that in a way become part of a new, larger, reinvented, creatively repurposed cityscape.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today's episode is a conversation with Jan Kattein.
I'm Jan Kattein from Jan Kattein Architects. I'm the architect of the Paper Garden building. My practice is particularly interested in doing civic projects that are developed with and for communities, and where in the process of designing and making them, social value is realised.
Back in September of 2023, I joined Jan at their project in South London called the Paper Garden, which is an educational building and garden space that they created for the charity Global Generation. It's a really inspiring project and something that I think everyone should be aware of as almost a sort of a touch point for what I think future architecture could and should look like. Some of the things we talk about are the fact that it's a radically circular building in the sense that it is made from 60% reused materials. It was actually built by 3,000 volunteers. Jan told me about how they had to take a flexible design approach to suit the available materials that they could find rather than specifying something very clearly from the beginning. What's amazing is the way they were able to, the few virgin materials they sourced was partly timber, which they sourced from an urban forest in London, Epping Forest. So really interesting conversation. Giulia Mori is the other voice you'll hear who joined me as a co-host on this. You can learn more about the Paper Garden at jankattein.com. The link to the project page is in the episode description. Before we jump into the podcast, I just want to take this chance to say a huge thank you to Kiki and Anjali, who have both recently donated to the podcast. It's hugely appreciated and it helps me cover some of the running costs of the podcast, including hosting the episodes and the website. Not free to run a podcast, and as well as that, it takes a lot of time. So any contribution that you can make is really helpful. And as part of my desire to create positive change in the world, I'm also donating 50% of all the podcast donations to other organisations that are funding climate work in cities. At the moment, the podcast is contributing to Trees for Cities, which, as the name suggests, plants trees in cities. It's a great organisation. So if you get value from this podcast and you're able to, please do consider making a monthly or once-off donation via the link in the episode description. It doesn't have to be much. Everything helps. And if you can't afford it right now, don't worry, the podcast will remain free. The other short announcement I want to make before getting into the conversation is about the Green Urbanist newsletter. For the past year or so, I've been releasing companion blog posts on my Substack newsletter alongside podcast episodes and with occasional articles and other bits of writing. I'm now making some changes, and instead I'm really focusing the newsletter down into concise, consistent weekly newsletters where I'm sharing useful and inspiring content on green urbanism. You can sign up to that by following the link in the episode description. I really hope this will give you some useful, actionable, weekly sort of advice and learnings going forward. I'm going to try and be a bit more consistent than I have in the past with releasing newsletters because I think it could be really helpful. All right, enjoy the episode.
So we're at the Paper Garden today. I want to tell you a little bit first about the organisation that runs the Paper Garden, because it's really important to understand how they work and what their aims and objectives are, to then talk about the project afterwards and understand how it came about. So Global Generation is a charity that's been around for, I think, about 20 years. They started off in King's Cross. King's Cross at the time was very much railway yards and industrial facilities, but gradually what was happening was that regeneration crept in, and one of the founders of Global Generation, Jane Ridderford, she was becoming aware of the regeneration and realised that community needed to become part of it. So she hooked up with the developer. Roger Madeline was running Argent at the time, and ultimately established the Skip Garden in King's Cross. So the Skip Garden had moved site 4 times, and their remit really was to connect community to the development and to the regeneration, but also they run a really amazing leadership program for young people as well, around ecology and sustainability. That program is still running, and it has vastly expanded. Global Generation now have 3 sites, and we're working on a 4th one. There is the Story Garden behind the British Library. There's the Paper Garden, which is where we're at the moment, and there's the Garden Barge, which is in Granary Square, and it's a converted barge. And we're working now on a 4th site, just off York Way, where there'll be a permanent garden for the charity, doing the work at the borough boundary between Islington and Camden.
Fantastic.
So Canada Water is changing rapidly. There's a big master plan that's been drawn up. British Land are gradually and step by step implementing that master plan. And Roger Madeline, who worked with Jane in King's Cross, he moved over to British Land and asked Jane Ridderford and Global Generation to travel with him, because he realised that actually that dialogue with existing communities and knitting the new development in with what's there already is really, really essential and valuable. So initially the charity was in the Printworks. Upstairs was the Printworks nightclub, and Global Generation were in the old ink room of the Daily Mail printing press below the dance floor, and they set up a really magical paper garden inside the printing room, involving a lot of the young people around here, families, school groups, and they did really important work during the pandemic. Gradually they took over the whole car park of the Printworks and set up a garden there. And then now what's happened is that the Printworks are being reconfigured and developed, and we were given this new site, which is just adjacent to the Printworks. So when we started off, the site was a big concrete slab and a metal shed on it. And well, a metal shed that didn't have any windows, that was cold in the winter, that was wet. So we were slightly scratching our head and thinking, well, what are we going to make of that? How are we going to ever grow anything in a place that's dark, and how are we going to engage communities in a place that's cold? So we decided that we'd take off the metal off the shed and just reveal the steel structure, and keep that as a semi-enclosure to the garden. And on one end of the old shed we built a new building, and that new building is built, it's just next to us here, it's built predominantly from found and reclaimed materials. And what's really fantastic is that we haven't just gotten a contractor in to do the work. We've had 3,000 volunteers help build this building, and the reason for that is that we were really keen that the environmental message and the sustainability ambitions that Global Generation have, that as many people as possible get engaged with that message through the building process of this building. And having spent 2 years on building it with 3,000 people, there's the hope that they'll act as ambassadors in the community to take forward the message about alternative approaches to construction, which are vastly more sustainable than what we normally see. The legislation or policy that sits in the context of this is the London Plan, and there is a target to achieve a 20% reuse of materials. We've achieved 60, and we've taught 3,000 people about that message. And we also hope, now the building is finished and open to the public, that it'll inspire others to maybe further raise the bar when we go along. So spatially, what we've got a big open plan space where there's a mezzanine, and that space has got the kitchen in. And actually, later on today, there'll be a group of residents that take part in the community cooking activity. They'll be coming in and they'll be cooking together, and they'll be eating out here in front of the building under this roof. You can see all the windows are sort of random sizes and colours and arrangements. And this isn't so much an aesthetic choice as it's much more that those were the windows that they were reject windows and cancelled orders from a Scandinavian window supplier called Nordan.
Okay.
They're very highly performing, very good windows, but they were earmarked for landfill. So we said, no, we'll have them. So we took the lot, and we developed a framework which would allow us to accommodate all these windows of different sizes and scales.
You had the windows before you did the facade design?
Not quite.
Okay.
We knew that we could get hold of windows, and we knew what the maximum sizes of commercial windows are, but we didn't have the windows. So we worked very closely with the structural engineer to come up with not a final design, but a strategy that would allow us to accommodate different sizes of windows.
Yeah, and I can see the vertical division allows for the width of the window to fit in quite perfectly. I guess you had a bit of a challenge on the vertical side of it, like
the horizontal, you mean?
Yes.
So the vertical, it's a timber structure that's got vertical studs. We were given a maximum size by which we were allowed to space those studs, and the wider they were spaced, the more horizontal noggins we were asked to put in. So there was a sort of framework that we worked to rather than a very specific design.
Gotcha.
And that allowed us then to accommodate what we could get hold of when the time came. So we had that relationship with Nordan. We knew we could get the windows, but we didn't know what size they would have at that stage. There are other quirky elements. So the staircase out here is a staircase that was reused. It was found and adapted, adjusted to suit its new site, and it's performing very well now. That would have been scrapped otherwise, and we would have had to make a new one. Then the other things you can see, the floor inside is made from doors. So the Citibank in the city was being stripped out for redevelopment, and the network of contractors across the Canada water site were a really valuable resource to get hold of materials. And by the time that we were on site and the building was starting to become visible, more and more we received phone calls or emails. Oh, we're taking out some doors. Do you want them? We're taking out a kitchen. Do you want it? So once a sort of critical level of activity had happened on site, people came forward and volunteered further materials.
Brilliant.
As we went along. Let's have a look at the side of the building.
Yeah.
So you can see the side walls are made from cordwood. Cordwood is a vernacular construction method often used in North America, and what it uses is lime mortar and wooden logs. So it's a bit like a brick wall, only that it doesn't use cement and it doesn't use bricks. It uses lime mortar and wood logs. It's a cavity wall construction because this building does need to achieve a good thermal comfort level inside, despite being made from found materials.
Sure.
And the other reason why this technique was chosen was that it's easily acquired by volunteers.
Okay.
So we needed to think very carefully what skills volunteers would have that we'd be working with, and how we could come up with construction techniques that they would be able to acquire in the timescale that we needed them to be acquired. And we had a real range of volunteers. We had school children, just 6 years old, but also we had a bunch of teenagers, and we had a lot of corporate volunteers from companies operating in and around Canada Water that wanted to do a day out and give something back to the community.
Fantastic.
So the wood is all from Epping Forest. And we knew the forestry department from the City of London who look after Epping Forest, and they're all prunings and trimmings and thinnings of the forest. We brought them to site, and then they were dried here. We built a drying room on site, and ultimately incorporated in the build. You can see the framing around the walls is made from railway sleepers. They were donated by Network Rail, and they give the whole building a bit of stability and also create a framework in which volunteers have got a vague chance, if they aren't very skilled yet, to get the wall straight when they were building.
Fantastic. So, I mean, these logs of wood, as you said, they came from sort of maintenance from Epping Forest, so within sort of 50 kilometres or even less probably. What would have happened to them otherwise? Were they sort of just been made into mulch or composted or something?
I mean, I don't know what the forestry team does with the wood. They would have been too small to be used usefully as to make paper or for building or construction.
Yeah.
Also because it's a range of species here.
Yeah.
So they might have either left them in the wood,
Sure.
releasing the carbon ultimately that they were capturing, or they would have chipped them up into mulch or something.
Yeah. So it's a construction technique. It's a way of using sort of low grade wood that you can't use for other. But they're not massive beams you can use.
No, absolutely. They're all relatively short length, and a range of species that wouldn't easily. You might be able to use them for paper making, but there isn't really that tradition in Epping Forest, so they wouldn't have been used for that. They were left over, really.
The only other place I've seen this is in Cat in Wales, which I know you guest lecture at, don't you? Hello, quick note from Ross here in the editing room. When we refer to CAT, what we mean is the Centre for Alternative Technology, which is a charity and an educational campus in Wales. It's actually where I'm currently studying a master's degree. We referred to that CAT for a few times, and I thought that might be confusing if you didn't know what the acronym was. Anyway, back to the conversation.
Yes.
Is that an inspiration?
Well, I knew about this before I first got involved at CAT, but it's really great to see that somebody else has had a go there. I mean, what's nice here is CAT is a really serene and wonderful place.
Yeah.
But actually, it's great to showcase here. You'd almost expect that at CAT, to showcase that here in a very urban location, and hopefully entice and inspire people that work in London and in a sort of metropolitan context, that it's also okay to use raw and organic materials for construction.
Yeah.
I know the British Land are very good at sharing materials that they don't need anymore from their sites and give them away for other sites, like steel beams being donated or shared with contractors, even outside their developments. But how did you find, obviously you said that later on in the development of these buildings, people were phoning you up to donate you doors and windows, etc. But how difficult was it at the beginning, like to have that word on the street that there were some windows that were going to landfill, and how did you get hold of that?
I mean, this isn't the first building of this nature that we've done. It's gradually grown, this practice. The skip garden was built entirely from reclaimed and found materials. There, the buildings on site didn't have to have thermal performance, so and they were very temporary because we knew the tenure on site was only going to be 3 to 4 years. So we learned a lot through that process, technically, but also in terms of networks. People who we just know people. I mean, these are often contacts that one establishes over a number of years, and that was certainly the case here. I mean, the window manufacturer, it was fortuitous. The rep, Tom, who looks after London, he's an architect, and he knew about our work, and he got in touch actually at some point to sell us windows. Okay. And I said, Tom, we don't at the moment have got a project that we need new windows for. I like your windows, they're brilliant quality, they're really, I mean, they're the top you can get. But we could do with your help in case you've got any surplus. And he did some digging, and he found so some of the windows are from a warehouse in Scotland, and some of them have come from Poland actually.
Oh, right.
So he looked through their stocks, and it does happen that orders are cancelled because developers go bust, or that things, the wrong RAL colour is specified or something, and then a really good window that's just the wrong colour gets discarded. And well, Nordon hadn't discarded them. They'd kept them in the warehouse, but they were sitting there gathering dust, and they were very happy for us to have them. And the same is happening again. We're doing another built like this in King's Cross, just off York Way, and again we've been given windows for that, and we're trialling other raw sort of construction methods. We're working with corbage there on one of the buildings, which is basically mud mixed with straw. The nice thing about it is it's got very good thermal performance qualities. The other nice thing about it is it's a great day out to work with mud and straw. So we're doing that in King's Cross. We're really looking forward to it. The site's coming forward. We'll have that next year, early next year, and then we'll be starting that build properly, and we'll have windows again from Nordon. And the other thing that's happening there is that we're actually being a bit more prepared, because this building has taken nearly 2 years, which is fine because its primary purpose wasn't to serve as a building but to serve as an educational process, promoting sustainable construction. So the fact that it took that long was helpful because it engaged more people. But in King's Cross we've decided we're going to pull forward some of the engagement work. So people are making their own bricks in King's Cross. For one of the buildings it's got a brick screen, so that's happening just now in the on our site there at the Story Garden. And also another one of the buildings, we're doing 4 little buildings there, is hung with timber shingles, and they're being carved again in King's Cross behind the British Library in the garden there. And everybody who's carved a shingle is allowed to engrave it with their name. So we'll have a building which will be full of graffiti on the surface of it.
So there's no real reason why you can't use these natural building techniques within a city, but is the reason it's so rarely done because it's so labour intensive, whereas in this instance you're using that as a benefit? I
mean, one of the real challenges is that the industry's been very good in developing certified approved systems, and there is an expectation from building control, for example, that a system comes with a test certificate in terms of its performance for fire and for thermal performance. We've seen how wrong that can go with Grenfell, which is incredibly sad. When somebody rigs the system and things aren't done that way. But here we've had incredibly goodwill from the approved inspector, who've been prepared to trowel through fire performance tests from other countries and things like that to build a good argument why this building and this construction method should be permitted. We're quite confident, having done that research, that it does perform at least as good as it should, if not better, and that it's safe. But that's a challenge, to build that argument. It's a lot of work. It's much easier to go buy something off the shelf that comes with a certificate, send that to building control, and they'll sign it off, and you're good. But to argue and to prove that we've got thermal performance and the fire performance here of a very unusual construction method is much harder.
Okay, but maybe you're setting a precedent then.
That's the hope, that this is again a scale up from the Skip Garden, and the new project we're doing in King's Cross, although the buildings are smaller than this building, they'll be permanent. So again, there is an extra challenge that comes with that, because clearly, if you're doing a permanent building, that you need to think about how it can be made to last.
And what's the timeline on this building? Is it?
So I think we're somewhere between 7 and 10 years.
Okay.
Obviously, developing a massive master plan around us, that timescale will only sort of finalise itself as time goes on. I mean, it's really, really helpful actually to do meanwhile, because you get to do things that are unorthodox, and people are relaxed about them.
Yes, yeah.
So getting this through planning and being quite frank with the planning officers and saying, well, we don't 100% know how this building is going to look. It's going to be, we know what size it's going to be, we know where it's going to be, but we don't quite know how it's going to. So people are a lot more relaxed when it's a temporary building, and they cut you some slack and let you get on with it. So one of the big challenges that we have working like this is the systems that we have in place that are really rigid. That's planning, that's building regs, and that we almost need to, alongside being innovative and inventive about the construction itself, we also need to be incredibly innovative and inventive about the process. And actually that's where, over the years we've sort of acquired knowledge that I'm really proud about, because it is all conforming to the regulations, but it is achieving that conformity in a very different and unorthodox way.
What about insurance? Because every time, as you said, every time timber is involved, or any type of wood is involved, there is that risk around fire, which is not always justified. It's probably a bit biased. And in my experience, I find that often if there is a buy-in from the client and a buy-in from the council, there might not be a buy-in from the insurers. So that's often ultimately the way that timber comes out of a development.
Well, I mean, it is building regulations approved, so there's a completion certificate, and that gives insurers a degree of comfort. You're quite right that sometimes they're digging deeper and they're asking more in terms of construction methods. I don't know those details. If that's something you want to find out, I'm happy to put you in touch with Global Generation. I mean, it's interesting because insurance also plays into the construction process itself. How do you get 6-year-old school kids to work on a building site? And how do you get that covered by insurance? But I mean, this also comes out of the practice that Global Generation have as a charity. They've always worked together with communities on gardening, on making things. So this wasn't a massive scale up and surprise for the insurance company. We've previously built things with young people. In terms of CDM and construction design and management regulations, the way this project's worked is quite interesting in that the CDM regulations require you to have a principal contractor, but it's very difficult to find a principal contractor able to work with community volunteers. In fact, I think there aren't any. So this is the second time that we've set up our own contracting organisation that's got the capability and insurance to do that. So here, in CDM terms, the charity itself is the principal contractor, and they have employed a skilled site manager who has prepared the construction phase health and safety plan, and who also has experience in working with volunteers. Bringing those two things together allowed us to run a very safe site.
Great.
There hasn't been a single accident despite 3,000 people having been involved in it, not even a small one. And it's all about tuning your approach to the skills you've got and the people you're dealing with.
Something that's on my mind is the fact that I think we're moving into an era with a lot less, reducing amounts of cheap energy, and the sort of construction abilities and the materials available to us through fossil fuels and that kind of thing. Looking decades into the future, But what we will have is human power and local materials and the natural building techniques that we've had for centuries. Do you see this kind of building as almost being... Do you look at this and think this is the future? Or could you see this becoming much more common and being used for different... This sort of method for becoming much more common in the future?
Well, I think it'll certainly be part of the mix.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that will happen in the future is that we will adapt... Well, we almost treat the city as a sort of box of found and reclaimed elements, and the buildings within the city too. It's quite clear that retrofitting and repair is moving way up the agenda.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real skill in doing that creatively, and it's different from the skill that is involved in doing new buildings. So I absolutely think that this approach can be scaled up to the urban scale.
Yeah.
And that we may not be looking at individual logs that are reclaimed or found, but that we may look at whole buildings that in a way become part of a new, larger, reinvented, creatively repurposed cityscape, which I think is really exciting, a really exciting prospect. Because materials that are reclaimed and found and buildings that are reclaimed and found, they come with a story and a history. And I think we're creating much richer, culturally much richer environments if we embrace that history and that culture that's embedded in that those used elements bring with them. So there will always now be a relationship between this building and the chief executive of Network Rail, who's been instrumental in organising us those railway sleepers. He'll feel an affinity and a connection to it, and in the same way Tom from Nordan, who organised these windows for us, he feels a sort of sense of ownership over the building and the project, which when you start things from scratch and just pay for new things, that you don't have that benefit. So it's obviously there are huge environmental benefits, but there's certainly also cultural and social benefits in this too.